Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. I sort of did these in real life recently. I helped our contributor, Patrick Stone, who's a high school teacher, teach a computer engineering high school class about video cards and GPUs. So some of the questions for this one will actually come from that class. But we've got a bunch from you as well, from Discord, and we might have one or two from YouTube. Leave your questions in the comment section below if you have any for next week. The big ones though, what are your hopes for Zen 2? How do you tell the difference between video cards in terms of what actually makes them good? And then we've got a couple on thermals that are really interesting, like does the temperature scale linearly on the CPU versus the ambient temperature? Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. So the first question comes from Discord. I don't have the user's name written down, but they asked, what's GN's collective hope for the TIC Zen cores next year, which I would assume is Zen Plus, and looking to 2019, what about Zen 2? Also, could you do a newer video or feature on memory performance and the differences between dirt cheap 2133, 2666, and more mid-range or high-end 3000 plus megahertz memory? So addressing the latter part of that first, the memory. Stay tuned. We just spent a lot of time testing memory all the way up to 4500 megahertz. We're just sifting through the data and we're rerunning every single one of those tests on another motherboard now because they work differently on different boards depending on the memory support of the boards. So we're working through that. It's a really cool feature. Getting to 4500 megahertz was really hard, actually. It took a lot of manual tuning because you run into an issue where not only are you now binning for better memory, which you can just buy off the shelf if you want to spend a ton of money on it, but you're also binning your CPU for a high core clock and a high IMC performance. So to get both of those things is pretty difficult if you want both the memory controller to be good enough to handle something like 4600 and if you want the memory itself to handle 4600, 4500, and you want the core to clock high. But as for Zen 2 and the Zen Plus stuff, so the answer here, what is the hope for it? First of all, I try not to have hopes about any product, ever. Honestly, I don't really speculate a whole lot or kind of like create a fantasy world of performance for different products because we're so invested in the day-to-day operations and testing that I don't really think that far ahead when I'm trying to predict performance for the future. That said, if I were to say what I wanted to see in Zen, I think one of the most valuable things that AMD could achieve with the next Zen implementations would be higher clocks. And they've got the core count down pretty well. They're competing with Intel. Right now, Intel won't be able to truly respond in a serious way, probably until late next year, and in terms of core count, that is. And they've responded with Coffee Lake pretty well, but it's clear that there's more there to do in terms of catching up with just raw core count and the price to per thread performance when you look at applications like Blender. But AMD has a lot of catching up to do with pure gaming, and there's room for them to do it. So Zen was a major change from FX, especially in terms of IPC. Fortunately, it's also the first step of this architecture, so the refinements you would expect to see increased frequency. This is typically what we see historically with other CPUs from Intel and AMD alike. What I would like to see specifically is I would love to see a 4.0 base or very close to it, and I'd love to see a 4.3 to 4.5 gigahertz boost on the core series competitors, so the R3, the R5, the R7. 4.5 I don't need. 4.3 though would be great. Anything in that range, a couple hundred extra megahertz up to 4.3 boost would be amazing. And maybe even they just get to call it 4.2 or 4.3, and then they have some XFR on top for single core performance. That would be great. So that's what I'd like to see. That's on my wish list. What I don't think we'll see is one of the slides I saw recently, which I think may have been faked or was, I don't know, a very misunderstood leak if it was an actual leak. But I saw a slide somewhere that had people in the comments at least suggesting a possibility of 5 gigahertz and 12 cores for, I suppose, what would effectively be an R7 replacement. I don't think that's going to happen. I could be wrong, and I would love to be proven wrong. But 5 gigahertz is like a 1 gigahertz increase, and you're talking about increasing the cores. That would be an amazing engineering feat. Again, it's possible, but I definitely wouldn't put my hopes on that. You're talking about going up to the speeds that Intel can achieve with heavy overclocking. So even if it happens, in the very least, you're throwing all power efficiency out the window. Hundreds of watts to get up to that kind of speed and that core count. And Ryzen's pretty good at being power efficient. It also, just like a lot of other architectures on the market, does start losing that power efficiency as you push the overclock to its limit. That's kind of what you expect with overclocking. But yeah, I don't think 5 gigahertz is happening probably at all. I don't think 5 gigahertz with 12 cores is happening. And when I say at all or not happening, I don't mean ever. I mean, I don't think it's happening with Zen Plus, and I'm not sure about Zen 2. No one is. But I don't think I would anticipate that. But we'll see. I have to see more information on Zen 2. That's a while out at this point, so it's possible. But Zen Plus, definitely wouldn't expect it. So yeah, my wish list is higher base and boost, and then beyond that, it's more of logistical things than actual hardware. So better communication with motherboard makers would be fantastic. AMD needs to kind of, you saw this with X399 and Ryzen, where there were 2 issues with boards. When Ryzen first launched, you could get as many CPUs as you wanted for the most part, but you couldn't get any motherboards. Intel's having the opposite problem. So it was an issue of the board manufacturers didn't have enough time from the time that the final microcode was submitted to the time that the press had samples. Motherboard makers had less than a month to get their BIOS finalized. And you have to factor in the time to ship the samples and organize everything too. So 2 weeks to get everything ready. So that was a big problem, and that impacted launch. It also impacted things like memory support, memory subtimings, all this really small stuff that added up and hurt AMD's initial launch. And they improved a whole lot of it. It really cleaned up. But that could be improved with better communication, and that is both on AMD and on the motherboard makers. I think the motherboard makers at this point know that AMD is serious now, so I think there's a better chance of Zen Plus and Zen 2 having more out-the-gate support in terms of actual supply and quantity of boards, and probably a more serious ear lended when it comes to planning the product and making sure it works with everything. So I think it's an issue of board manufacturers maybe being in a position of fool me once and not wanting to invest a whole lot in it, and of AMD not necessarily knowing how to communicate what their needs were to the board manufacturers or convince them of a good product. Hopefully a lot of that's fixed just by being tested with time. Another thing here, better education for media. So we kind of went through this ourselves, where every time we asked AMD for use cases for things, like Threadripper is a good example, you'd run into scenarios where it's like, okay, so I get it, it's fast, but if I can CUDA accelerate this task or GPU OpenCL accelerate it, then what's your use case? Give me an example of something that I can test to show that this processor makes more sense in this application than a GPU does. So they were pretty bad at answering that, and we found a lot of answers on our own. For example, with Blender, if you do an orthographic render with an image that effectively looks 2D at the end, where you're rendering tiles very quickly, it matters more, from what we've seen for the most part, to have a higher tile count in flight actively, simultaneously, than just to have a GPU pushing it. Because with Threadripper, you get 32 tiles in a flight simultaneously on the 1950X, and that's really valuable. But no one told us that. We had to find it ourselves. And fortunately, we can actually find that stuff because we use Blender in-house. But if you don't use Blender in-house as a reviewer and you just use it as a benchmarking tool, you might not know. So that's something where AMD could improve on, is education for media. there's a lot of other examples of that too, where FFmpeg H.264 encoding was something we found Threadripper really good at. And we don't do GPU transcoding for our compression needs. So Threadripper was a great use case for that, and so is R7, but had to find it ourselves. So those are the things AMD can improve on. It's communication and education for their partners, and then hopefully some frequency boost as well. Next question. This one is from Soupa, who says, when discussing delta T over ambient results for cases, coolers, etc., is it relatively accurate to assume that if I ran an identical test in my home with a different ambient temperature, I'd get the same delta T? Basically, if a CPU heats up 50 C in a room at 25 C to a final temperature of 75 degrees, is it safe to assume it'd also heat up 50 degrees in a 35-degree room to a final temperature of 85 degrees? This is a great question. So we're assuming a few things here. If you've ever taken a physics class, they probably made some kind of joke like assume a spherical cow or something like that. Mythbusters did that one as well. The reason you do that is because obviously to discuss this, we have to assume that when you say you're running an identical test, that you also have our identical hardware, because the variance even in silicon can change those numbers. So let's assume that. Let's assume that we shipped you our setup. The question, just to recap, is if my room is 25 and your room is 35, will the temperature increase exactly by 10 degrees in your room in the final readout because your room is 10 degrees warmer? And the answer is kind of, but not really. So this is something we've spoken with VSG from Thermal Bench about this in the past, months ago, and I think included part of his answer previously. But what it comes down to is the more recent launches from Intel, from Haswell onward, behaved a bit differently than some of the others. So before Haswell, it was more or less a one-to-one, just like you're asking. With Haswell onward, so once you're at steady state, the core temperature will increase almost the same as ambient. So that kind of follows the pattern, but the IHS temperature is not the same increase with ambient at steady state. That's where the difference emerges. So when we spoke with VSG of Thermal Bench a while ago, he observed that a CPU versus IHS temperature increase variance was about 1.4 to 2.2 or 2.4 degrees Celsius on a Haswell sample, and that was tested with a hotbox that I believe VSG configured between, I don't know what the low end was, but let's just call it 30C, and I know the high end was 80C. So that was his ambient change. It's something to 80. It's pretty big. So speaking with him, it sounds like this is a result of thermal resistivity of the heat spreader's alloy having a hyperbolic function with temperature. So it starts to run away a bit, in other words, as the ambient temperature increases, which means no, it's not perfectly linear like we would like, but the CPU core temperature somewhat follows that curve, at least for a while, and as you do increase ambient, it does get more extreme and exaggerated. So basically, the ambient temperature, to an extent, we can basically write it off as an assumption of these will be pretty close. They will be at steady state, pretty much a one-to-one gain in each. But once your ambient starts getting, let's say, I'll just give what our tolerance is. If it starts going above like 3 degrees different, then it's time to probably consider alternatives to testing. You might be able to get away with 5, but as you increase ambient more and more, it will run away more and more. 3 to 5 degrees isn't really going to hurt anything realistically within the other resolution of the test, like the measuring equipment and the software measuring. But once you start getting beyond that, it does get a bit questionable. Next question is from I'm A Jedi Brah, who says, VRM on motherboards. If you use the same CPU to test multiple boards, will the VRM of each board help determine the volts needed to run the chip stable at overclock? Better VRM equals better OC, question mark, or just help with temperatures to spread out the power and such. So for this one, there is an extent to the usefulness of how high-end you go with VRMs and motherboards. There are definitely diminishing returns at some point once you start looking at a $200 board versus a $250 board. A lot of people would have trouble finding a difference in terms of the max stable overclock. The differences are elsewhere often. There is definitely a difference to some extent with the boards though. So an example of this would be one of the the Z370 boards we've been working with the 8700K. So on actually X299 boards as well. On some boards, the better ones, I'm often able to get the same clocks as the lower end, but with a little bit less voltage. Some of this comes down to the VRM itself. Some of it comes down to the vendor and their BIOS implementation. For example, the load line calibration setting has a slightly different curve with each vendor. And when you need to start using that, whether it's a flat line or a slightly curved up line or slightly curved down line, that impacts the voltage going to the CPU ultimately and the V droop. So that's part of it. VRM quality is part of it. Spreading the heat, definitely. If you're using, for example, a B350 board with one of the worst heat sinks and comparatively one of the worst heat sinks, and you have limited airflow, you can definitely make it throttle. We've done it pretty easily, actually. But that impacts your overclock through an indirect means, thermal throttling. So as for ignoring thermal throttling, things like that, the answer is yes, kind of. You might be able to get a slightly higher clock, or more likely you get about the same clock and you have better voltage tuning options if it's a better BIOS. Yeah, I spoke with Buildzoid about this too, and he agreed that there's a limit to the extent of how much you actually gain in terms of noticeable clock and voltage differences when overclocking on the high-end stuff. But there is a difference. The other thing is how much power can it push. So if you're someone like Der Bauer and you know you're going to push 900 to 1,000 watts into the CPU, you better have a good idea and understanding of what the motherboard's VRM can tolerate and what kind of cooling you need to tolerate it, whether that's liquid nitrogen or something else. So there are definitely places where it matters a lot more, but for the non-LN2 user, there's a limit. Next question is from Darth. This one's really quick. Darth says, I've been given conflicting advice when recording gameplay on the same hard drive as the game you're playing, assuming 7200 RPM over SATA 3. Is there an issue of affecting the video quality when using something like Shadowplay? The answer is basically no. Not with Shadowplay, not with, I can't remember how to pronounce it now, Relive or Relive? Relive, right? Yeah, AMD's Relive. That name was an awful choice. Yeah, I think so. I don't remember. Whatever it's called. I know when we did the first video on it, there's no difference. Maybe with with Fraps. So with Fraps, you will, with hard drives especially, it'll bog down the drive. And so if the game is on that drive, you will definitely hurt the frame rate. We've seen it. And Fraps basically records losslessly. It's hundreds of megabits per second. So that would be an instance, yes. But Shadowplay, don't worry about it. RJ Fleming, on askgn number 7, that's going back. You said you use the same bench to control for tested devices, i.e. CPU, GPU, heatsink, etc. Does that mean you also do not take driver, BIOS, or OS updates to ensure data is not contaminated? For example, 1070 Ti on 388.09, but the comparison with the 1080 was surely on an older driver. Just curious. Not much can be done without rerunning the entire Nvidia lineup on a newer driver, unless you did that, in which case you guys live in the lab. Also, do you use system images to keep the OS clean? We do live in the lab. I especially live in the lab, but if you... so the last question, do you use system images to keep the OS clean? We do. So when I worked at Dell, we learned we had a really good system of Pixie booting, where you would do boot over Ethernet. And so we'd Pixie boot into a server, and then you stored all of the system images. At the time we used Norton Ghost. And Norton Ghost would allow us to clone the drives, often including the drivers. Sometimes you'd do a bear clone, and then not a clone of a bear, but a bear as in Baron clone, and then pull that down. So that allowed us it afforded us a lot of convenience and flexibility where during testing something goes wrong. It's the same thing here where if your OS gets contaminated, and it will, over time the drivers get dirty or updates break things or whatever, you can just pull down an image, no big deal. It's like 10 minutes to pull down the image, and you just start over with a completely fresh OS, all the test tools installed, the entire environment's ready to go. So it's like a 10-minute clean OS plus setup. You can't get much better than that. So yeah, we keep system images specifically to make sure that there are no issues with dirty drivers, because that happens a lot as well. And a bad driver ruins the data. It's not even just the driver. It's even if you use DDU, which we do, it's possible that something gets left behind and messes up the results. Or maybe the chipset drivers get messed up. Or when you're swapping motherboards and CPUs and GPUs and RAM, Windows has a tendency to tie itself into knots. So this is what we call driver gremlins in testing, where you don't necessarily know what's wrong, but something's wrong. One of the easiest ways to create this problem is to move a drive from an AMD platform to an Intel platform or vice versa and observe the performance disparity. And that's just because Windows 10's gotten better at it, but absolutely I would not do that for testing. We have isolated Intel and AMD images for that reason. The rest of the questions, do you control for BIOS? Yeah, that one's pretty easy to control for. We only update BIOS if it has something we actually need or if we're specifically reviewing BIOS. And I have another folder on the server with all of the BIOS is backed up, so we can pull them if we need to go back for some reason, if we need to roll back. Drivers we control for as best we can. The thing with drivers is you have to look at what changed. So we keep close contact with AMD and Nvidia so that we can ask what changed in this driver. And then we do some tests on our own. So it's normally 1 or 2 ad hoc tests, just a dry run through everything, make sure nothing's changed. If it hasn't changed, then we can keep that data just a little bit longer. And if it has changed, clearly something needs to be rerun. So the difference with something like a 1070 Ti on 38809 is that often the newest video card launch with its press drivers that we use internally, they sometimes get iterated on before they go public. So the press drivers we use internally are a repackaged version of the most recent previous driver, just with included support for the card. Almost never there's a difference for performance. It's just basically they add support for the card. So fortunately we're able to use the previous driver, which we probably used for another test, and then use 38809 or whatever it is for the 1070 Ti. That said, every now and then a driver release completely wipes the results clean. Destiny 2 had such a big driver update from Nvidia recently that we can't use that data anymore for new GPU benchmarks until we rerun the things that are relevant. So what I do, obviously part of what we do is try to retain a large amount of data for comparative purposes. And then as stuff ships, I will rerun tests with a more limited suite of cards. So Destiny 2, again, as an example, because I know that's updated, I will, next time I need to test the game, I'll rerun it with probably the card I'm testing plus its competitors plus and minus 1 price category, and then we'll leave everything else out. And it sucks to lose some of that data, but that's what things like Firestrike are there for, or things like Metro Last Light. That's why you keep some of the old games, so that you always have scaling data that drivers will never impact. And then you can update the most recent games with the most recent drivers. So there's a good spread of, here's the recent real use case, and as an academic study, here's some scaling information if you're trying to figure out how it works with whatever. And that answers the other question people ask a lot, which is, why do you still test some of these old games? That's why. There's nothing wrong with having an old game or two on there. It's not taking anything away from you, and it adds data for people who need it for older cards, because just testing the newest stuff doesn't help people. People are trying to figure out, do I need to upgrade from my 3-year-old device, yes or no? Not, well, people who are building a brand new system need to know how the new stuff performs, but a big part of the market isn't. Hopefully that answers some of it. There's so much more information to that, but I'm just going to stop there. If anyone has more questions about it, let me know below and I'll take them next time. And I think there's let's take this one, a question from, so this is from the class that I helped teach on GPUs. So the big takeaway I wanted them to have at the end of the day was how to identify what makes cards good in general, because these are high school students. They kept asking me, which card is best for GTA 5? What's best for Destiny 2? It was always, what's best? What's the best video card? And if you take that question at the face of it, the answer is a 1080 Ti or a Titan XP. You probably shouldn't buy those though, especially not if you're a high school student who's either sponsored by their parents or working a low-wage job, probably. So that's the hard answer. But you know, this is all stuff all of you know, but teaching how do you address your needs. My needs are this price, this game. Do I care about 3D rendering, whatever. But the next thing I tried to teach them was how do you look for and identify what makes a card good, because, and I'm talking about between AIB partners here, not between GPUs, because everything I tell them about the 10 series today will be useless in a year when they have the money to build a computer, because the 10 series and RX 580s will probably be sort of slowly vanishing from the market as new things roll out, whenever that may be. So instead of focusing on the RX series and the 10 series, what we did was talk about cooler differences and things like that, where you identify a good video card by hopefully looking up some reviews where they've done actual thermal testing. We do a lot of this, and power and noise testing. So it's important to identify, what am I using the product for? How much money do I have? I try to figure that out before I start looking. And how much am I willing to flex on the price? And then you're looking at, okay, with my needs, maybe I want silence, maybe I want overclockability. Then you go and look for the card, and this is stuff most of you know. However, looking for a good cooler isn't as simple as pick the biggest one, because as we learned with the Zotac Amp Extreme card, the biggest cooler isn't the best cooler. So it does take looking for reviews, and if they don't exist for what you want, you can kind of look for photos of like a side view of the card and try and look down to see where's the contact between the cold plates and the VRM components. Are there thermal pads where there should be? Is there an unnecessary amount of plastic? Does it look like the cooler itself is mounted with hardware to metal plates, like the back plate and the base plate, in multiple locations, or does it look like it'll flex a bit? How does it look for sag? Things like that. That's kind of what you look for. And then on a component level, you look for videos from people like BuildZoid to figure out if those will survive long temperatures and long uptimes for overclocks. So really basic stuff, but the kind of fun thing with that experience was how the widespread of the knowledge level in the class. There were people who had never built a computer and didn't know what a GTX 1070 Ti was, which I named because it just came out. And there were people who had built their first computer already. So it was actually really difficult to kind of like step back enough where everyone is following you, but still provide depth, which I guess is sort of what we do here, just at a more, with a baseline assumption of knowledge that's a bit higher. So that's it for this one. If you have questions for next time, leave them in the comment section below or on Discord, which you can join by joining our Patreon group, patreon.com/gamersnexus for that. You can pick up a shirt like this one at store.gamersnexus.net. We presently have this anniversary edition model on sale. And of course, subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.